Okay, hey there everyone. Thanks for stopping by. Charles J. Baserap here, welcoming you to another episode of Hashtag The Thing here on YouTube. This one's a follow-up of last week's episode covering the origins of the Israeli-Palestinian crisis from late 1920s through 1979. One of the things that I have found in 20 plus years of study of the region is that a lot of what I had to say in the last video and will say in this one have largely been unknown and often not discussed, such as UN resolutions, words and actions from both sides that have kind of flown under the radar, and that's made it a lot easier to just paint it as a simple black and white, right and wrong, manichaeistic matter for which there is only one answer, right? There's no grays. I've seen the posts throughout social media, you probably have too, and the way several news organizations frame the stories by their headlines. There's a lot of I stand with Israel and focus on the 100% provably malicious intents, actions, and networks of Hamas that portray Israel as beyond reproach, and any criticisms of IDF activities or governmental edicts to be inherently anti-Semitic and emblematic of exactly why Israel must do what it's doing. There's also been a lot of, honestly not surprising to me based on my personal observations over the years, huge, seemingly acceptable anti-Semitism coming from a lot of elements on the left in solidarity with the Palestinians who compartmentalize Hamas from the innocent people caught in their crossfire and conveniently ignore tactics and speeches and who see it as a mismatched underdog story in which Hamas did nothing but revolt against an oppressor just like the American revolutionaries. Critics on both sides have been crying about President Biden's ineffectual approach thus far, waffling and unsure, and his seemingly playing both sides of the conflict by not more ardently calling for a full ceasefire and providing funds and equipment to the Israeli government and also to Iran, who in turn is helping fund Hamas's military activities. We're basically like a third party right now in Star Wars. We're helping build X-Wings and TIE fighters alike. We saw that in the recent trilogy where they talked about that, saying they don't care who they're building for, they're just weapons manufacturers. That's basically what we're being right now. And that's something to look at more critically. Now, one of the things that struck me the most is the absolute lack of self-awareness of the hardliners on each side and the double standards of what's, quote, allowed on social media and in Congress versus what isn't when you have American professors with revisionist mindsets going past educating and into indoctrinating and allowing passes for decidedly hateful racist speech when it suits them. Congresswomen essentially mouthpiecing Hamas after a history of anti-Semitic comments and attitudes. A CNN contributor posting things praising Hitler in the past that have come up more recently as he continues to post not just criticisms, but pure hatred towards Israel. Protests that are literally calling for the rape and death of Israeli children and all Israelis, right-wing sites labeling all Palestinians as terrorists and refusing to brook any critique of disproportionality or compromise. Republican politicians just parroting self-defense over and over again and demanding we get more involved, presumably fully on the side of the military, and so on and so on. Heck, just today, for fun, something I've done before, a thought experiment I've done with Facebook, I reported the post on Facebook that I took a screenshot of for proof, so I had it. It was a cartoon of an IDF soldier holding a Palestinian civilian at gunpoint, but the reflection in the mirror wasn't the Israeli flag on the helmet, but rather a Nazi swastika. It was determined by Herr Zuckerberg that it didn't violate community standards. Wow. I had a post removed last year that was from 8 years ago that had a caption of "Scissors beats paper." And it was a picture of Churchill giving the peace sign and Hitler saluting. Scissors beats paper. Rock, paper, scissors. Right? I was threatened with a lock on my account for a very obvious anti-Nazi meme. But this one, however, was deemed okay. Nothing to see here. The war with Eurasia is going swimmingly. You see, here's the thing. As I've discussed already, it's not nearly as neat as people seem to want it to be. It's easy to see one side's view that they were attacked and have a right to defend themselves. And it's just as easy to see the other side's view that parts of their land are illegally occupied and they have a right to free that land and exist as well. It's easy also to look solely at casualty numbers, currently around 1 Israeli for every 20 Palestinians, or on individual heartbreaking stories about a school here, a building there, as a microcosm of the conflict. But it's like when looking at a painting, you need to step back fully to really grasp the way the colors go together and, more importantly, why they do, how they do. A big difference in one side is, in this is that, one side has at least shown some begrudging willingness to coexist. The other has it written into its very charter that their goal is the complete eradication of the other. I understand why those of Jewish ancestry are protective, given the history both past and present. And we have to remember that still Jews are the largest targeted of hate crimes, worldwide. That's still a thing. It hasn't gone away, since World War II ended. And I also get, though, why minorities worldwide, and here in America, especially of late, feel a shared sense of identity with the Palestinian peoples. In fact, during the Iranian Revolution in the late 70s, the Ayatollah tried to convince Black Americans to back Islam and Iran, trying to link Israel and white Americans together to say their causes were the same. It's a tactic that's been used, numerous times, and it was part of how so many converts in prison were converted to Islam through people. That was one of the things that they were giving out to people that were infiltrating, parts of America, like that were coming from Iran, coming from Al-Qaeda-linked groups, was the goal to target people who were oppressed, people who were suffering from systemic racism, because they would be the most susceptible to turn on, ultimately, the white-run government of America, which would bring the downfall of capitalism and all. There was a whole, plot that they wanted, but that's something that's actually in their handbook as part of their SOP. I took some flack for my last video, as is typical. Every video I do, I lose people, and it's going to happen. And I take it from both sides, always. A friend, now former, I guess, on her part, she actually accused me of Nazism because I condemned Israel's illegal building of settlements in violation of law. A total stranger, emailed me and called me an out-and-out racist because I, quote, dared to suggest Hamas was in any way wrong by targeting the imperialist Zionists on their land, end quote. It takes all kinds. Some other people emailed me and were rankled by something I said, and it was suggested that I was insinuating, when speaking of Yasser Arafat's rise and the PLO's attempts to show magnanimous charity and link all struggles to the plight of the Palestinians, past and present, in part to shield the more militant actions from criticisms, that I was drawing a link between those tactics and groups like Antifa and elements of Black Lives Matter and hardline Trump supporters still claiming a stolen election. So before I go any further, I wanted to apologize. I never meant it to be ambiguous. I was all but outright saying it. That there are elements within those groups that keep hiding behind legitimate concerns and keep tapping into the emotions of people with partial narratives, revisionist histories, and fears of the other to deflect from violence and insurrectionist actions, whether it be storming the Capitol in a post-election tantrum, causing hundreds of millions of mostly peaceful damage while calling for the death of cops that Facebook doesn't think violate community standards, as I found out via experimentation, annexing city blocks and shaking down its occupants in extortion rackets, perpetuating conspiracies about stolen votes and masks being used to take over the nation, and so on. And I stand by that. I've made my positions quite clear in my opening miniseries, Racism in America, among others, on where I stand and why. And when you're openly and unequivocally announcing that you're in, quote, full support and solidarity with Hamas, end quote, not the Palestinian people, but with Hamas, an internationally recognized terrorist organization, or when you're calling for a disruption of future elections so that they don't get stolen and vote to remove a person from her congressional position because she dared to speak out against dear leader and have members of your party still denying an insurrection attempt took place, yeah, I'm still standing here on this side of the line. Thank you very much. All right? So now that cleared up, let's get to it. Like the first part, this part's going to be long, though it shouldn't be as much. And it's going to talk about the two main intifadas and their origins and how international law and bodies have effectively hamstrung lasting peace through flawed systems and lobbying and alliances that often boil down to the enemy of my enemy diplomacy. As I read passages from my book, An American at the Crossroads, this is it here. I don't know if you can see through the glare, but this is written back in 2010. And you'll see how it's still very relevant today. I'll be interjecting commentary on how it relates to today with relevant examples and examinations of the issues to illustrate the complexity and, in my opinion, help teach some people shared histories that are very rarely known to the layperson, And as with the last video, there will be work cited in the video description so that I can give credit to those I quoted from, and so that people can look them up for themselves if they'd like to. I had a friend do that and actually looked up some of the resolutions that I talked about to see where I was coming from, just to make sure I wasn't, it also helps, keep me honest. I'm not just pulling out quotes and citations out of nowhere. They're actually real books, and you can look them up yourself to verify it. So, let's get into this. I do, as always, I appreciate you giving it a try. I know these videos are long, but I do hope you get something out of this. I'm trying to do whatever I can to push past the partisan noise and the static that's out there and try to give you something that's got more balance to it. Yes, I have opinions. No, I'm not always right, not all the time. But there's a lot that I have floating around this head from 20 plus years of study and experience in this field that I really do want to share, and I really do hope it reaches some people. All right. First thing to know with the Intifada is that in the late 1980s, Iran and Iraq were in the back half of a decade-long war, so a lot of eyes were fixated on that. The occupied territories at that time, they exploded in the first Intifada, which is Arabic for breaking apart, but it's commonly translated to as uprising in this particular context. And that started out in December of 1987. Like many conflicts, the Palestinian revolts were set off by a seemingly trivial event that managed to provide a breaking point for the parties involved. In this case, a vehicular accident in which a car driven by an Israeli struck and killed 4 Palestinians. It was something that was to be echoed in many ways a few years later in America with the Crown Heights riots, in which 2 Guyanese children were hit, one fatally, by a Jewish driver who had accidentally run a light and lost control of his vehicle while following an Orthodox leader's motorcade. And he was subsequently, seemingly in the eyes of the black community there, given preferential medical treatment and whisked away to a private facility and stuff like that. That combined with the growing tensions between the two groups over the years in turn resulted in the murder of Yankel Rosenbaum at the hand of a group of about 20 black men, and several days of riots that eerily had a lot of the same types of signs and slogans we've seen recently, especially anti-Semitic ones. It was pretty rough, back then. I was not down there, but I was alive for it, having grown up in the Bronx from 1979 to 2004. So I do remember being very much aware of this. Now, though the Intifada, as well as the subsequent terror campaigns in the occupied territories, eventually came to be associated with and attributed to Islamic terrorists, and for those unaware, an Islamist is not the same as a Muslim. An Islamist is a more radical individual with the ultimate goal of installing strict Islamic law, Sharia, at any cost. Whereas regular, for lack of a better word, Muslims aren't like that at all. They're not out to get you. They're not here to subvert our society. Do not treat them badly. Or I cannot express that enough. They are not the same. Think Westboro Baptist Church versus non-Crazy Pants Christians. All right. The reality is that religion did not play a role initially in the violence. Rather, it was a multitude of things that built up over time before being released in a series of angry outbursts, underscoring a very important fact that's often overlooked by Western observers in regards to combating terrorism. The occupied territories are especially susceptible to terrorism for reasons that go beyond the simple "they hate the Jews" philosophy that is most often used to rationalize the violence. The problem, unless the West can make a substantial commitment to helping to bring about a true and lasting peace which is fair to all parties, will most likely increase as the generations born into the region are further removed from the earliest days of the conflict. The old debate of nature versus nurture comes into play often in cases like this. It's said, and I've said it myself, people are not born hating, but rather must essentially, be taught to hate. I remember my daughter being in daycare, and she was, completely beside herself that these 2 boys in her daycare class, she was like 4, were going to get married. She's like, they can't get married. And I was like, well, why not? And her reason, they're too young. Not because it was 2 boys, but because they were too young. That's how she saw it. Because she lives in a house that's not teaching her that that's a bad thing, for 2 guys to get married. So you are essentially taught to hate. The most recent generations and the current generations of Israelis and Palestinians are living in a much different environment from those before the 1967 Six-Day War. At the time of Israel's annexation of the occupied territories, people on both sides of the divide had distinct recollections of a period without an occupation. Regardless of their views on the outcome of the wars, people still had an understanding that at one point, the land that became occupied by Israel was not always so. Now, in contrast, even though that knowledge is still present in some respects, the people growing up there have no such recollections. For them, the occupation has been a constant factor in their lives, and as a result, you have one side feeling that any withdrawal to the pre-1967 borders would be a betrayal, and the other side feeling hopeless and dealing with the realities of a lack of true independence. The attitude is fostered by both sides, even on children of impressionable ages. On the Israeli side, school books and academic curriculums often don't tell the entire truth of the land, much like early American and still too many current American history books neglect to mention about the dealings about the early Native Americans and blacks and other minority groups in the United States. Quote, Israelis were used to believing that the occupation was improving the standard of life for Palestinians, and many had grown up to think of the West Bank and Gaza as part of Israel, a perception insufficiently challenged by teachers in the classroom, where maps of Israel often did not even show the green line, the pre-1967 border of Israel, end quote. Now, some of the misconceptions were understandable, as the occupied territories did in fact experience a growth in schooling opportunities and infrastructure under Israeli control. The flip side is that, due to checkpoints and IDF crackdowns in reaction to militant actions, the inhabitants that most often got to benefit from such opportunities on a regular basis were the Israelis themselves. Of course, the Israelis were not the only ones guilty of something of a revisionist history. Especially after Hamas rose to prominence, Palestinian youth became increasingly taught about the evils of the Israeli state, with Hamas even running, quote, summer camps where children are indoctrinated in Islamist ideology and trained in how to participate in violent protests, end quote. That's some crazy camp. That's next level Crystal Lake, Now, there have been instances where Palestinian kindergartners have been made to dress up as suicide bombers for graduation ceremonies. How messed up is that? Although the car accident that killed 4 Palestinians on December 8th of 1987 was the final catalyst, the conditions in the occupied territories combined with the failures of the PLO to adequately solve the Palestinian problem or what allowed the Palestinian rage to rise in the first place. Israeli settlement expansion was becoming a huge problem, leading many in the international community, from human rights groups to the United Nations, to condemn the practice and remind Israel of its previous obligations under resolutions such as 242, which I discussed at length last time out, and I'll have that video linked at the end of this one if you missed it. Now, Israel argued that it was abiding by international law, and that since the occupied territories technically did not belong to any one particular nation, as Palestine was not an official state, settlement activity was therefore not illegal. Additionally, they argued that the resolutions pertaining to the matter were passed under Chapter 6 of the United Nations, which is true, and as such are not legally binding, unlike those under Chapter 7, such as the several passed with regard to Iraq in the 1990s and beyond, a fundamental flaw within the United Nations. However, even as various international bodies debated the legality of settlements, the Palestinians viewed them as further proof that even if they were to be granted independence, their potential state was growing smaller and smaller, and with more settlers came a further strain on natural resources of the land. Settlement growth was actually quite staggering at the time period, as, quote, during the first 13 years of occupation, 1967 to 1980, only about 12,000 Jewish settlers resided in the occupied territories. But from 1980 to 1995, this number increased more than tenfold to 146,000, end quote. At the time of the Intifada in 1987, there were approximately 60,000 settlers present, still a significant increase from the beginning of the decade. In addition, many Palestinians saw the PLO as more interested in carrying out attacks than in actively engaging in any sort of constructive problem solving. The attacks brought about the wrath of the IDF, and most often Palestinians who had nothing to do with them were the real victims. And this is a very real criticism that even Black Americans have voiced in the past year when lamenting actual solutions and lack of transparency and funding pertaining to their very real struggle for equality through BLM and other groups. That's been a critique that's been out there for a while now. Where's the money going? What is being done exactly? Why are you buying $1.4 million homes in an all-white neighborhood? All these complaints that have been coming out, and it's starting to look a lot like that, and that's giving ammunition to the people who don't think there's any problem, who have their blinders on, and that's not helping either. Classes taught on the house of cards of the very historically inaccurate versions of, critical race theory, and, companies prostrating themselves publicly, that's not going to do it. There needs to be more actual plan and more things to it than that. But getting back to Israel and Palestine, Palestinian villages were suffering from poor living conditions, and the PLO was doing little to provide job opportunities and medical treatment for the people. Now, as such, it's fair to say that the Intifada was as much a revolt by Palestinians against their failed self-appointed leaders as it was against the Israeli occupation. As far as results go, contrary to the belief that suicide bombing was the norm in Israel and the occupied territories, the truth is that the first Intifada seemed to feature more stone throwing and the setting of fires than anything else. The suicide bomb did not enter into the equation until 1994, over 10 years after Hezbollah introduced it to the region in Lebanon when they attacked French and American paratrooper bases. And that led to us pulling out of Lebanon. And that was a big thing in 1984. That's when the suicide bomber really first came about, and that's when it became known, and the groups actually met with one another, Sunni and Shiite groups alike, to learn. And Al-Qaeda, bin Laden was very good at adapting the tactics of simultaneous terrorist attacks, and ultimately culminating obviously in 9/11, in which it was like near simultaneity where those attacks went off. So it was a big flashpoint in the region. The Israelis on their end had somehow missed the warning signs of the Intifada, despite the increases in protests in the preceding years, and as a result, they were largely unprepared to handle it. Believing at first it would pass in a matter of days, not years. They'll get over it, Due to the actions of the PLO and the frequent military incursions of the surrounding Arab nations since 1948, Israel often handled the protesters with extreme prejudice. So used to dealing with militants wielding guns and militaries with sophisticated weaponry, the Israelis had a tendency to engage in something of an overkill when facing civilian mobs throwing stones and homemade incendiaries. The Palestinians were viewed as just another military threat and were treated as such, much to the dismay of the vast majority of the international community. And that's been a complaint that I've expressed and that we've seen, especially in the past year, of American policing in dealing with demonstrations, even when they aren't particularly violent, and especially when being led by minority groups. So these are things that we're seeing real-world applications even far removed from it. So it's important to look at all of these different facets. In several instances, the IDF attempted to repress the revolt by use of not only rubber bullets and tear gas, but also large-scale weaponry and live ammunition. The, quote, burial alive of 4 Palestinian youths and some deaths of Palestinian infants following their exposure to tear gas, end quote, being only a few examples of the outcomes of measures taken in response to the uprising. Almost immediately after the uprising began, the Security Council was forced to act, once again, with Resolution 605, which, quote, strongly deplored those policies and practices of Israel, the occupying power, which violate the rights of the Palestinian people, resulting in the killing and wounding of defenseless Palestinian civilians, end quote. To be fair, while it does not in any way excuse the Israelis for their actions that went above and beyond, it must be understood that since 1948, the Israelis were living in a perpetual state of war with much of the surrounding region. As such, their military was interwoven into the very fabric of their society, with every able-bodied citizen required to enter into service upon their reaching 18 years of age. And there existed something of a hair-trigger mentality, one that would increase with the advent of suicide attacks in the following decade. To the Israelis, every move against them was seen as yet another attempt to destroy their existence, and they acted as if each instance was a matter of their very survival. While this doesn't absolve them of their sins, just as we've examined the circumstances that helped give the rise to the Palestinian violence, we also must look into the origins of the penchant for the harsh reprisals of the Israelis and what they had gone through. The PLO, in addition, just same as the Israeli government, they were also caught napping with the rise of the Intifada, so out of touch with its own people as it was. Yasser Arafat sought really quickly to seize upon the opportunity to piggyback on the publicity of the riots to further his own status on the world stage. It was against this backdrop in 1988 that the role of Islam that's when it really began to directly play a significant part in the Palestinian struggle, with the emergence of Hamas. Previously, it had been more of a question of Arabs, of Arab nationalists, and the more nationalist regimes of, even Iraq was more of a nationalist, more of a secular regime than, say, Iran, which was very hardline in terms of being an Islamist, country. Hamas was the brainchild of several Palestinians who were influenced by the Wahhabist teachings of the Muslim Brotherhood, most notably Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, who played a major role in expanding the teachings of the Brotherhood in the Gaza Strip during the late 1960s after being imprisoned by Nasser for his revolutionary activities. Like Qutb and al-Zawahiri before him, Yassin emerged from prison more radical when he began his sentence. It was conversion within that radicalism in the jail. That's something we've seen several times happen. It's happened with Arafat, and that's what happened here with Yassin. Unlike Arafat's PLO, Hamas, which is Arabic for zeal, they took on a more religious slant and arose as a challenge to the failed secular ambitions that the PLO seemed to take. For centuries to that point, Wahhabists had preached the importance of Islamic rule and stood firmly against the secular regimes ruled by man's laws. Interestingly enough, Hamas and the PLO, though opposed in terms of their overall goals, they actually shared some common interests in their challenges to one another and their failures and accomplishments, and served as a reciprocal symbiosis that greatly led to the expansion of each group. While Hamas formed just after the beginning of the Intifada, it didn't become a true presence until the middle of the following year, its charter making sure its goals possessed no ambiguity. Quote, Israel will exist and continue to exist until Islam will obliterate it. Any part of Palestine shall not be squandered. It, or any part of it, should not be given up, and there is no solution for the Palestinian question except through jihad. End quote. That's their charter. That's literally their founding. We have the we the people. That's theirs. That's their preamble basically. This is a group that people are backing today, mind you. A group that's very charter actually says it's seeking to commit genocide. So you might want to look again at what the right side of history looks like that you keep spouting, because that ain't it. All right. The charter also invoked the famous Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a fictitious work that originated in Russia in 1903 and claimed to be proof of a massive Jewish conspiracy to take over the world. Though the work has conclusively been proven to be a forgery of anti-Semitics in Russia, its legend has become repeated so often that the fiction has become fact for so many in the Arab world, and even among certain white supremacist groups in the U.S., not to mention black nationalist groups like the Nation of Islam. And we've seen rappers and athletes in the NBA and the NFL spout a lot of these things on Twitter in recent years, and it's still there. The story of it being a forgery has become the falsehood. No, it's not really a forgery. The forgery was just made up. It's ridiculous. For over a century, the protocols have been used as proof of Jews controlling every aspect of world society, from international banks to all parts of American foreign policy, and to justify the cause for their destruction. At a time when the Palestinians felt oppressed by the Israelis and betrayed and neglected by the PLO, Hamas stepped into the vacuum, and sometimes with financial aid from Israel, who at first saw them merely as a counterpoint to the PLO, ironically, they set up hospitals and shelters, mosques and education and recreation centers. In short, all of the things that the PLO failed to provide. That is why, and I have mentioned this previously in several other videos with regards to the dangers of assumptions on all Trump or all Biden's voters and supporters, it is not entirely fair to broadly paint the Palestinians as a whole as being supportive of terrorism simply because Hamas won a majority in the Palestinian democratic elections of 2006. The PLO had become irreparably corrupt. Money that should have been used for the people lining personal coffers of its leadership, Arafat's refusals at times to condemn terrorism, and his failure to recognize substantial compromises presented by the Israelis made him an ultimately ineffective bargainer in terms of securing a firmer backing from the West, especially the much-needed United States. Ironically, the actions of Hamas, such as their penchant for consistently attempting to derail any peace processes and their refusal to compromise, more substantially answered the needs of the people because such actions were accompanied by basic needs being provided. In something like a manifestation of Stockholm Syndrome, the Palestinians, though aware that many of Hamas's actions were the cause of several crippling Israeli retaliations, they became more enamored with finally being able to send their children to school or having more access to medical treatment than they were appalled by the suicide campaigns. Though many Palestinians did and still do support the terrorist activities of Hamas, a great deal of them were willing to vote for anyone other than the leadership that had failed them so greatly time and again. It wasn't so much a vote for Hamas as it was a vote for anybody but what they had. Hamas's influence over the people and the fact that the new organization presented a serious challenge to the PLO led Arafat to try a new tactic. All right, let's try something else out. In November of '88, in response to Hamas and also to take advantage of the outrage of the international community at Israeli actions, in a, quote, declaration of Palestinian independence, the Palestinian National Council accepted the existence of the State of Israel and endorsed all relevant UN resolutions. End quote. It's a pretty big deal. The move was met with approval from much of the world, most importantly President Reuven. Even though it was seen by many as transparent, Arafat's subsequent actions showed that this was more of a dog and pony show, an attempt at garnering a greater ability to enhance his diplomatic standings rather than achieve a true peace. Much of the language in the PNC's declaration seems to even be contradictory in nature and even vaguely conditional at times. While there are proclamations of peaceful coexistence between the Israelis and the Palestinians, the calls for peace are ironically juxtaposed to praises for the revolution of the Palestinian people, so it's kind of hard, it's kind of all over the place. But the most important part of the declaration, at least as far as the United States and much of the West was concerned, was that the Palestinians promised to subscribe to the notion of the, quote, settlement of international and regional disputes with rejection of threats of force or violence or terrorism, end quote. Though, as time would certainly tell, the actions of Arafat often spoke more accurately and loudly than those words. President Reuven showed support for the declaration, which put Israel more directly under the world's microscope. And as Reagan left office and was replaced by George H.W. Bush, that scrutiny only increased, with his administration seeking to strike while the proverbial iron was hot and push ahead a new peace deal that called for the end of settlement activity, especially now that Arafat had, on paper at least, forsworn terrorism and acknowledged Israel's existence and their right to do so. Secretary of State James Baker reprimanded Israel for a failure to fully commit to the process, stating that, quote, now is the time to lay aside once and for all the unrealistic vision of a greater Israel, forswear annexation, stop settlement activity, allow schools to reopen, reach out to the Palestinians as neighbors who deserve political rights, end quote. That's Secretary of State James Baker saying that. Now, despite the harsh rebuke from Baker, Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir stood firm in his policies, and eventually it was Arafat who made his way back onto the bad side of the Americans by showing his true feelings on terrorist actions. In May of 1990, 7 Palestinians were killed by an Israeli gunman near Tel Aviv. As a result, factions of the PLO began to plan an attack on the city, but their plot was discovered. The U.S. pressed Arafat to condemn the action, but he relented, which led to an American veto before the Security Council and a souring of the new relationship between Bush and the PLO. Now, Arafat had requested the UN Security Council send help in the form of an international monitor to investigate Israel's actions, and a resolution was in fact drafted which called for, quote, a commission consisting of 3 members of the Security Council to be dispatched immediately to examine the situation relating to the policies and practices of Israel. However, despite 14 nations voting in favor with 0 abstaining, the United States used its veto power to defeat it, one of nearly 30 such instances in which America would be the sole veto in a Security Council resolution condemning an action of Israel between 1983 and 2006, an ironic and bewildering flaw inherent in the structure of the Security Council. For while it professes to uphold democracy, a lone veto can and often does derail an otherwise majority motion. As Arafat, Israel, and the United States pushed and pulled against one another, Hamas continued to establish itself more dominantly in the occupied territories and to push the religiosity of its mission upon the populace. A violent 1990 incident at the Temple Mount, precipitated by the proclamation of a Jewish extremist group known as the Temple Mount Faithful to march on the holy site, gave the battle against the Israelis a spiritual dimension, and Hamas began to more earnestly preach that those who died in the name of the Palestinian cause were martyrs for Islam, and the targeting of Israelis was a holy duty of all Muslims that they were obligated to carry out. That's part of the reason I've said before, it's hard to argue with this situation. When you believe that you are divinely ordained to do something, man's laws be damned, right? That's all you're going for. So it's hard to get past that sort of mentality when both sides are embroiled in it, and you have in this part of the world, you have more hardline Christians who are also on the side because they believe this is necessary. This is all in accordance to the Bible. It's there, you can't use that as an excuse. You can't use divine whatever as a right. It doesn't work that way. It didn't work, back in Manifest Destiny or the Divine Right of Kings. It doesn't work today. It's time to put on your big boy pants, and you can still have religion without being crazy about it. All right, think about that. But the Palestinians' outrage at the Jewish occupation was now mixing more Islamism into the previously already almost entirely nationalistic drive to expel them from the occupied territories. And the more charitable deeds that Hamas did, and the more it showed an ability to provide necessities to the people, the more people were drawn into their web. Eventually, the Intifada calmed down as Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in August of 1990 and the inevitability of a war in the Middle East as the year came to a close seemed to focus attentions elsewhere. But Arafat, in another gross miscalculation, supported the actions of Saddam Hussein, further darkening his status in the eyes of the Americans at a time when most of the other Arab regimes were beginning to see the errors of their interactions with Israel and began to push for peace. However, Shamir, he persisted in expanding the settlements until Bush essentially bullied him into attending a peace conference in Madrid by threatening to cut significant funding to the Israelis. A regional peace initiative was beginning to take place, but the ramifications of the Intifada were far from over. Hamas's rise to prominence and its ability to win over large segments of the Palestinians ensured its continued existence in the occupied territories, and before long it was able to reach out to other Islamic groups who had shared similar aspirations, such as Hezbollah. Israel's often brutal practices in trying to quell the Intifada damaged its reputation in the world community and set it under a magnifying glass that groups like Hamas would use to their advantage to exploit any actions of the IDF that could be used as propaganda for their cause. And we're seeing that today with the way certain factions of the news are framing these stories by what they're choosing to focus on. The sympathy for the Jews that was at once seemingly unwavering after the days of the Holocaust and such was now beginning to falter, and many actions of the Israelis would be called into question, regardless of them being right or wrong, regardless of that being fair or not. America played an interesting role in the sense that while it continued to do its best to shield Israel from the actions of the Security Council at times, it also took important steps in showing the Palestinian people that the peace process was something that they would take seriously, and that a Palestinian state would be a real possibility. Now, there's a common saying that a sequel rarely lives up to the hype of the original, but while that may be true for a lot of movies and shows and whatnot, it's anything but for the second Intifada in the occupied territories that erupted in late 2000. Much like the first Intifada in the 80s, the second uprising was triggered by an event that by itself seems relatively insignificant, but compared to the other combined with the other factors, such as the continuing decline of living standards and the oppressive military incursions due to suicide campaigns and vice versa, it became the latest catalyst to widespread chaos. In summer of 2000, President Clinton tried to hold another Camp David summit, but it was soon apparent that neither side was willing to compromise for a lasting peace. The issues of settlements and the right to return for displaced Palestinians, as well as the PLO's inability to prevent increasingly violent suicide attacks against Israeli civilians, prevented both sides from seeing eye to eye, and especially on the question of Jerusalem, which had earlier been proposed as a shared capital, neither was willing to budge, as the religious aspect of both the Israeli and the Palestinian sides hold the city too sacred and too integral a part of their identities to have it divided, which is what made promises of presidents to recognize it as a capital of Israel so big, and what made Trump saying that it is such a huge thing in that area. That was nuts. It got crazy over there for a little while. I watched that. I was kind of my heart jumped when I saw that. I was like, oh man, it's not going to be good. But it's too integral to their identities to have it divided, and to call it one or the other is essentially cutting the other one out. During his presidency, President Clinton did make several strong attempts to reach a deal, but most often, though through no fault of his own most of the time, the process repeatedly fell apart. By the time the new century had begun, the Israelis and Palestinians were far too entrenched in their mindsets, and as reprisal was met by reprisal, it was often impossible to truly determine who shot first. This is a Han and Greedo situation, back and forth. Debate is going to forever be held. Who has the remastered, who has the original versions. With tensions in the territories at a flashpoint, on September 28, 2000, Ariel Sharon, a member of the Israel Knesset, who was known for his more hardline ideologies and his implicit involvement in the slaughter of Muslims in Lebanon in the 1980s while serving as defense minister, he paid a visit to the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, a site that's revered by Jew and Muslim alike. The Palestinians reacted by rioting on the following day, and the second Intifada, known as the Al-Aqsa Intifada, was underway. The first and second Intifadas are, realistically, only alike in name only. While the Palestinians did in fact have legitimate gripes at the onset of both, The second was more of a war than a series of uprisings, and, quote, this time the attacks targeted innocent Israeli civilians directly and made no distinctions between the administered territories and Israel proper. No longer were end quote. No longer were stones and poorly improvised incendiary devices the primary concern of the Israelis. Suicide bombers were unleashed by various Islamic groups. And with the change in the Palestinian tactics, the IDF became more brutal than ever, collective punishment being a primary practice as homes were bulldozed and missiles fired into residential areas from which the attacks originated. Arafat once again showed his ineffectuality in recognizing what needed to be done. While his fear of standing up to Hamas and sparking a civil war was in many respects understandable, what is not is the fact that much of the violence seemed to be encouraged by him through Fada, despite the PLO's repeated renunciations of terrorist activities. The actions of Arafat likely resulted from an underestimation, of Israeli resolve. Since the 80s, Israel had occupied parts of southern Lebanon to serve as a buffer, first against the elements of the PLO and then against Hezbollah. After a protracted struggle with the Shiite militants, Israel in June of 2000 finally decided to pull its troops back. As with similar acts by the Americans in Lebanon and in Somalia, what I talked about last time with the Black Hawk Down incident, the end result seemingly encouraged more terrorism. It was seen as an acquiescence. It is quite possible that in his mind, Arafat asked himself why he was trying to jump through diplomatic hoops for the international community to gain an Israeli withdrawal when evidence existed that proved that he could effectuate a retreat more quickly through violent means. And that's at the center of the debate that I brought up in the Racism in America videos in talking about protests and demonstrations versus riots and the different aspects of how people like Congressman John Lewis saw things versus how Malcolm X saw things, and why both of them acted in the way that they did, why their approaches were so different, and why they have such, strong followers on both sides, because they do make good arguments. Sharon's visit to Temple Mount was merely an excuse. To be honest, he wasn't doing anything wrong there. But the second Intifada, it would have happened regardless. It would have. But of course, all this is not to say that Israel was completely blameless for the violence. It's common practice in many circles, especially in Western media, to paint Israel as the ever-beleaguered innocent victim like Shakespeare's King Lear, more sinned against than sinning. But the hard truth is that Israel, in some respects, is in fact complicit in the cyclical violence that has reigned in the region for the better part of the last 70 years. There's no doubt that Israel has the right to exist. But the inalienable right to defend itself, against attacks notwithstanding, at the same time, the tendency at times to use disproportionate means of retaliation, regardless of the legitimacy of a reprisal as a response to a terrorist incursion, often fuels the anti-Israeli sentiment. Israel is caught in a very tough situation. It's completely unfair to ask and expect a nation that has come under attack countless times in its short existence to show complete restraint. But at the same time, there must be an awareness and a realization that many actions, such as blanket home demolitions and restrictive checkpoints that severely limit the mobility of Palestinians having nothing to do with the violence, they do more to radicalize the populace than tame it. And that's again going back to this past year, where I've been saying how these things, you may think that they're making some headway, but all they're doing is causing the other side to dig in deeper. It's getting further and further apart. It's not helping. Additionally here, as an established member of the United Nations, Israel falls under a certain amount of scrutiny, whether it's always fair or not. As such, it's held to a higher standard than a terrorist group such as Hamas, which isn't even officially recognized as a leader by a lot of countries. With whom, while it's certainly deplorable, the attacks take a heavy civilian toll. And it's expected. It's going to happen because, in other words, let's put it this way, one expects the villain, and not only the one seeking to play the hero, to act villainous. Just as Arafat grossly miscalculated that a military uprising would be too much for Israel to handle after its experiences in Lebanon, so too did the Israelis overestimate the effectiveness of their tactics in putting an end to violence. Eventually, Israel was able to stem much of the violence within its borders, but it came at a terrible price for the innocent Palestinians, many of whom, they began to enter that dangerous recruiting pool for groups like Hamas. Able to capitalize on the media and the monitors from human rights groups, Hamas and Arafat also waged an image war against the Israelis. Not only did they have to fight the military actions of the Palestinians, but now they had to defend themselves from international criticism, much of which was sometimes unfair as actions were taken well out of their overall context. the Security Council passed Resolution 1322 on October 7, quote, calling upon Israel, the occupying power, to abide by its legal obligations and its responsibilities under the Fourth Geneva Convention relative to the protection of civilian persons in time of war of 12 August 1949, end quote, after seeing the disproportionate numbers of dead on both sides of the conflict during the first week of the violence. While there is no doubt that the IDF used excessive force on occasion and committed more than a couple of human rights violations, there seemed to be in some circles a stark disproportion in the reporting of it. It is incredible that in some media outlets the Palestinians are completely at fault, while in others it's the Israelis that are the root of all evil. We're seeing that play out again right now. While Israel has definitely been guilty of overreach at times, we've seen how Hamas is literally using media buildings and underground tunnels beneath civilians to house weaponry and launch attacks. That's not even up for debate. We have seen the evidence that is literally impossible to deny. Looking at the casualty disparity alone often fails to take this into account. It's one thing for innocents to tragically be caught in the crossfire against legitimate hostile targets, and all steps should always be taken to, do whatever you can to minimize or eliminate any innocent lives being lost. It's another thing to intentionally target civilians. Hamas isn't just striking at the occupied territories under dispute, it's willfully targeting the established OG borders and territory and mainland, Israel, if you will. Much like Al-Qaeda didn't try to attack military bases, over here in states, they chose symbols like the Trade Center and the Pentagon. Hamas is not getting Israeli civilians accidentally caught in the crossfire so much as aiming directly for them. And using the defense that since they all are, were, or will be IDF for a time by national law, and they're all part of a people that they've sworn to, in the words of former Iranian President Ahmadinejad's words, wipe off the face of a map, something a few congresswomen, based on their attire and now deleted tweets, seem to be okay with. That means that they're there, therefore fair game. It's part of the reason why Gal Gadot, who played Wonder Woman, came under fire for calling for peace, and people were just ridiculously right away from her, calling her a racist because she was part of the IDF. She was an IDF combat trainer back in the day, per her obligations, as an Israeli citizen. But it's that sort of mindset, that is guilty by association type deal, ironically coming from people who justly complain when they're deemed guilty by association or just being. It's funny how we can compartmentalize in a way that it's okay for us to do it, but not okay for others to do it to us. And that goes in a lot of different ways. Israel often faces a question. Just because they can do something, in this case, target a legitimate Hamas terrorist base, should they do it? Especially without weighing the potential fallout. We saw the other day a video that was circulating of the IDF calling off an airstrike because of the presence of children in the vicinity. Hamas wouldn't have had any such compunctions. They've intentionally suicide-bombed discotheques and pizzerias filled with kids, on purpose, not because they thought they were going to get an Israeli, military target. But at the same time, we've also seen the IDF bulldoze entire neighborhoods that Hamas was using as bases, often without knowledge of the civilians living there, then leave and do nothing to help rebuild or provide aid. Well, that's not going to help. The whole situation, again, it's far more complex than any basketball player or actor can tweet or any hashtag can get across. And as you can see, there's a lot of blame to go around. Right now, President Biden has to poop or get off the pot. If we're to stand for anything as we claim we do on the international stage, we need to be leading the way towards a lasting peace, not vetoing common sense UN resolutions because of alliances or because we're afraid to upset somebody, not punishing the entirety of the Palestinians or the Israelis for the actions of Hamas or the IDF, and not pussyfooting around it any longer. Big-time problems require big-time solutions, not waffling and indecisions and waiting to see how this plays out. I have been sounding this drum for 20 years plus. No one can argue that everything I wrote in my book in 2010, it still applies today. I've just demonstrated that. How? Am I psychic? No. Because here's the thing. Like our new Captain America said about Baron Zemo, right here on my shirt, a lot of these things, I'm out of line, but I'm right. Think about it. Look into the history before changing to the profile pic frame du jour. Think about the complexities and facts, not the tearjerker pictures, several of which aren't even from this year. Think about who you're going to stand with. You can support Israel's right to defend itself and criticize actions it takes that run contrary to true justice. And you can support a Palestinian right to its own independent state and still say no to wanton violence, targeting civilians intentionally, and a ruling charter that again literally calls for genocide. Do you really want to throw in with a group like that? Is that really going to make you seem any better when you sit there and say, I stand with Hamas? It's amazing how pertinent my talks from last year with race and the election, how they translate into this conflict. Who could have possibly foreseen that? It's almost like I've been saying that all this time. It gets frustrating. It does. I appreciate everyone staying with me. That's going to wrap this up. Stay safe out there, folks. Always use your brain. Everyone, thank you again, stopping by. I do appreciate the few, the proud that actually bother to listen. But hoping, maybe change, one mind, one life at a time, right? This is Charles J. Baserap with #TheThing, signing off. Be well.